welcome back to Inquiring Minds. My name is Doug, and thanks for joining me for another Pen Resurrection Sunday. I've decided to return to the in-your-face introductions to the Pen Resurrection Sunday videos because I've just upgraded my iPhone to a new iPhone 15 Pro Max, and the front-facing camera resolution is now in 4K. I'm super excited that you can now see all my wrinkles and blotches in glorious 4K resolution on your 60-inch TVs.
What do you mean?
And the main cameras on this new Apple iPhone have improved from 12 megapixels to 48 megapixels, and the difference is dramatic. What better way to show the glorious detail of the resurrection of this 71-year-old Parker Vacumatic in emerald pearl, but with a piece of 21st century camera technology. This pen was totally dead, kaput.
This parrot is no more. It has ceased to be. This is an ex-parrot.
This was an ex-Vacumatic, until now. Let me show you how I brought this beautiful old pen back to life again, right now. So I got an unknown packet that's come from Indonesia, and the declaration on it said ballpoint pens. I don't remember ordering any ballpoint pens, so someone is sending me something. You know, when I send things to other people, they get my address, and then they want to send things back. So we'll see what we've got here. Leave that for the sweeper. And it's in a red box. And, aha, I know what this is. So I was unaware that I bought this from someone in Indonesia. But this is a beauty. No, I did buy this. I bought so many pens recently. This is a ooh, it's got someone's initials on it. Yeah, I do remember. Oh man, that's stuck. Yeah, it's got all kinds of old ink in it. But this is a celluloid green stripe Parker Vacumatic, non-blue diamond, but with the upscale chevron cap band. And a nice, and there's the 0.57. So I'm not sure about that point. It's Canada. So Canada did some weird things with their date codes. So I'm going to have to check. Is it made in Canada, Parker Vacumatic, 2 dots and 52, 1 dot and 57 on the nib. I got this for a relatively low price because that nib is broken. You can see the tine has snapped off. But I thought, well, I've done nibectomies. I'm going to call them nib brisses from now on, and I'm a fountain pen moil. And I'm going to see whether I can make that into a stub. That's a stunning Parker Arrow nib right there. Yeah, it's all seized up. But I bet you that's translucent on the inside. That is just all gunked up. So that seal is completely gone. I don't know whether someone tried to force ink out of it or what, but it's a mess. And there's marks all over it. And one dead pen candidate for resurrection right there. And today's cadaver on the slab waiting for a new life is this Canadian-made Parker Vacumatic in emerald pearl celluloid. This is a 3rd generation model Vacumatic. In the US, Parker discontinued this model in 1948 in favor of the new aerometric filling system. Some have seen this as an advance in fountain pen technology for Parker, but I disagree. Yes, the Vacumatic is an older technology dating back to the early 30s for Parker. The aerometric may have been more efficient and cost-effective to produce and easier to maintain over the years, but in my books, the Vacumatic is still a superior filling system. Vacumatics have a capacity almost twice that of aerometrics, and I hate squishing the aerometric vinyl sack with that sharp aerometric squisher bar, whatever you call it. This is my friend Ron's dad's 1954 Parker aerometric in a beautiful maroon color with a gold-filled cap. Isn't that nice? So if Parker stopped making the Vacumatic in 1948, why is this one dated 1952 on the barrel right there and 1957 on the nib? Well, it was made in Canada, that's why. So here's what I learned about Parker date codes over at Tony Frischer's wonderful website, parkerpens.net. Quote, In the second quarter of 1938, this system was, however, changed to save production time, and a new date code using a system of dots was adopted. The stamp initially had 3 dots, and for each quarter, 1 dot was filed down, leaving none for the fourth quarter. Since production was overlapping, examples exist with either the imprint 28 or .8 for the second quarter of 1938. Also, since this coding system extended over a decade, a pen marked 38 could be produced in the third quarter of either 1938 or 1948. In 1950, a new system for the date coding was introduced where the 2 digits only indicated the year, not the quarter. Hence, 50 means made in 1950. This system was used in the US until 1955 and in Canada a few years longer. So, this being a made in Canada Vacumatic, this stamp of 52 says the body of this pen was made in 1952, whereas the nib was made in 1957. This nib, therefore, may have been a replacement. But let's take a look at what this pen looks like before restoration and what it will take to bring it back to the land of the living. Now, before we get started with attempting to restore this pen, let's take a look at what shape it's in to begin with. It's fairly grimy overall, and it's got some blemishes on the celluloid. This one looks like a bit of a burn mark or a melt mark or something. The Deco split feather clip is a non-blue diamond or non-lifetime warranty version of the Deco clip, and there's a black top jewel. The gold is in pretty good shape. I don't see much brassing at all. The cap has the usual kind of wear on it all the way around it. It has that wonderful hatched cap band in gold, and part of it doesn't have that pattern in it, so you can engrave that with your initials, which is unusual. I've not seen that before. There are no cracks in the cap whatsoever, and the emerald pearl celluloid is very chatoyant and wonderful. So that's going to all polish up very, very nicely. Unscrew the cap and take a look at the body. This could be translucent. It's full of a lot of old gunk and old dried ink, but looking at it through the light, I can actually see it's a transparent barrel. Some of these were not transparent. It has some initials engraved in it. Let's see what it says. TRIRIRUHUTAREA. So that's IRU Hutera. Someone's name engraved in there. I'm going to take that off, and we go around to the imprint, and we have Made in Canada, Parker Vacumatic, and a patent number. I can't quite make that out. I have to get out my loop. It says Reg TMS, whatever that means. And on this other side, it says Pat NO 313, and it's worn 182, something like that. And then a .52 dot. So if Canada was doing the dot to mark the quarters, that would be the second quarter of 1952 for the barrel. The blind cap is very, very sticky and hard to remove, so I'm hoping that that's just gunk, and it is because it's still wet with sticky old ink. We'll try to remove that vac pump, but the pump actually functions, and looking at the translucent barrel, I can see that there might be remnants of sac inside there. Let's take a look at the section here. This is an old-fashioned section. In fact, I don't remember ever seeing an old-style step-up section on a Vacumatic like this. I'll have to do some research on that to see. But again, Canada did some weird things. And this nib looks like it is extended far beyond what it should be. Let's take a look at the nib. It says Parker, Canada, 0.57, and registered TM, registered trademark. And there's the ebonite feed. The whole nib and feed is misaligned. And we'll see how close we can get here with my new iPhone 15 Pro Max. But you might be able to see that that tine is broken. Put my magnifier on, you can see it better. There you go. You can see how that tine is broken off. Now, I knew this when I bought this pen, and that's why I got it cheaper than you would ordinarily get this vintage unrestored Vacumatic. But I have previously done a couple of these nibs where their tines were broken. Here's my favorite Parker pen. This is in my collection. I write with this pen almost every day. And I flipped that nib off and made it into a stub, and it is divine. I also custom made that section because it was all gouged up, and I sort of custom shaped it. And I also put a new brass Vacumatic pump from pentooling.com on this pen. So it's totally customized and personal to me. It is a 1945 third quarter blue pearl Vacumatic made in the USA. Blue diamond. It's just a gorgeous pen. So I figured that I did that to that nib. I can probably do the same to this nib. Fingers crossed. And I'm guessing that maybe someone had installed this nib incorrectly, and the reason that that tine is broken now is because they put it back on and it engaged with the top of the cap. I'm not quite sure that it would touch the very top of that to break it, but it's possible. But that nib and feed needs to be further down inside. The barrel itself has lots of scratches and wear over time. The blind cap, same thing, but there's no bite marks, no huge gouges. So it's in pretty good shape for restoration. The real question mark is whether I can get that nib clipped off. So I'm going to do, forgive me, my Jewish friends, but I'm going to call this doing a nib bris. And I'm going to be your Professor Fountain Pen Moyle and see what we can do about clipping the useless tip off of that nib and see whether we can make it into a writable stub. And of course that reminds me of a joke. Send the children out of the room, and the joke is, what do you call the useless piece of skin at the end of a penis? Well, of course, that's a man, isn't it? I don't even think I want to put that back on there again. We got all our parts together. What we'll try to do is remove that section. These were not glued in, and I have noticed before that this actually moves a bit. Yeah, it does. I didn't take it all the way off. I wanted to save that for you guys because these are ink-acquiring moments, aren't they? That's really caked up with old ink, but it's coming off. There we go. Yeah, there might be an old sack in there. Hard to tell. Lots of old caked up old ink. But now we can pull that breather tube out of there and soak all these bits in an ultrasonic bath of pen flush, which is 9 parts distilled water and 1 part ammonia. We'll let that soak for a while, and then we'll knock that interesting looking feed out. That breather tube is a lot heavier a gauge than I'm used to. But again, these are Canadian parts from 1952, so well past the age of Vacumatics in the United States. So we'll soak all of this in the pen flush ultrasonic bath and come back and see whether we can knock that nib and feed out of there, and whether we can get that pump out of that barrel and clean up the inside and see what shape that pump is in. So fresh out of the pen flush bath, electrosonic bath, got a lot of black ink out of it. I think I know why that was also black with ink. It was full of ink, and there is a bit of a sac in there, but that was all covered in ink because it's leaking, which means the sac has been detached inside there. So it needed replacement anyway. We'll put our small bits away where we won't lose them. And then we'll use the vac extractor from the Inky Nib. That's Scott at the Inky Nib. Invaluable tool, this. And we'll see if we can get that. Oh, right. I thought it was the small one, and it wasn't fitting for some reason. There's the small one. That large collet marked L right there is for the large Maxima size Vacumatics. So we screw that down tight, and before we apply any heat at all, we see whether we can get it to budge. Yes, it does. And I might just apply a little bit of heat to it anyway, because it's not turning well, and we want to be patient with celluloid. So we'll get out my heat gun, turn it on low, And then just give the barrel just a bit of heat to help expand that celluloid a little bit. There we go. That goes a lot easier once it's heated a little bit. There we go. Now that won't come out because that sack is still attached. So we'll release the collet. And there are tools you can get to push the remnants of that sack out. But one of my knockout block rods, you can feel that sack in there. Let me just give it a little bit of a push. It should. Yeah, there we go. It should push beyond. And there it is. There's still lots of ink in there. And we push it all the way out. And there it is. And there we go. That's why it was leaking, because it's already detached from there and all the ink was getting inside and around that collar, down the inside of the rod and out onto the back of the rod. So we can just pull that sack off of there. It should not have any adhesive on it, pressed up against the inside of the barrel on that little ramp, but it is attached on the inside with that pellet. And we'll just pull on that, and the pellet should remain inside that cup. Okay, now I think I'm ready to try to knock this nib and feed out of this section. It's a fairly unusual section for a Parker Vacumatic. Here's a normal Parker Vacumatic section. This pen is unrestored, and you can see that nib. That nib really needs some attention. But there's a normal section, and here's the one from Canada. So it has this step on it, which I've never seen before. And also, the back of the stem here has a bevel to it right in there, and that breather tube hole is fairly wide. And so the purchase you have to be able to knock that feed out of there is very small. So I'm going to have to use, I think, the smallest rod I have in my Bill's knockout block. That's just slightly larger than the hole and slightly smaller than the opening. Find the right hole to put it in. Always got to find the right hole. I always put a little bit of blue tack on that opening there just to hold it in place when I press the section down, and it keeps it from shimmying. We get out our hammer. So let's give this a try. That was very, very simple. And there's the nib. Of course, we saw all of the imprints on that nib above the section because I think it was too far out. And there you can see that break in that tine. And there's our feed. Let that soak for a while and polish it up as well. So I use my Dremel tool to drill into that pellet, and then my dental tool to pick out the remnants of it. And it worked fairly easily. There's still a little bit of old sack still in there that I've got to clean out a bit, but that should be ready to accept a new sack. Now I got a standard Vacumatic sack. I'm going to put it on my Inky Nib pellet pusher tool, which has an indication right there on where to trim it, which I find very, very useful. You don't have to get out your calipers and measure. I'm going to trim a little bit of this off first. My little pen scissors, trim a little bit off to start. There we go. These are called pen cut scissors. Very cool. I can get right down to the pellet. There we go. So I can feel that pellet pusher pushing right up against the pellet. And then I can get my X-Acto blade out and feel where that groove is right there and cut into that groove just like that. Works like a treat. Thank you, Scott, for that pellet pusher. We push that right in there. Now let's see whether it'll fit in the cup. In the pellet retainer, I should say. It's almost too large for it. Don't want to bend that rod. There we go. Boy, that took a real snap. Only goes to show you, it's always something. So let's put a little talc on this sack. You need to have your sack nice and smooth, clean, so that you can fold your sack up on itself. I know it sounds painful, sometimes it is. But let's see whether we can get that pellet in there and see if we can fold this back on itself. Sometimes, there we go. Sometimes it wants to go like a roll instead of a cuff. So I'm going to fast forward through this because this takes a bit of teasing. So you'll excuse me while I tease my sack. It does take some teasing. I keep calling this a sack. Of course, it's not a sack. It's not an ink sack. It's a diaphragm. It's made of the same material as latex sacks. There we go. So now that's all ready to go to be installed into the barrel, which I've cleaned out. And we're going to add a little silicone oil to both the cuff itself, like that, just so it slides nicely into the barrel without any kinks. You don't want any kinks in your sack. Sorry, you don't want any kinks in your diaphragm. And a little on these threads to make it slide nicely into those threads of the barrel. And we just give a little bit of a twist like that. And it should get it past that little lip. There we go. The important part is that that diaphragm sits up against that metal cuff. And when it screws in, it clamps it to the inside of the barrel. There's no cement needed. No glue needed. Give that a turn, and it's turning very nicely. Good. And we can turn that into the barrel. Turn down the collet and turn it hand tight. Give the collet a spank. There we go. Yeah, that feels like it's working. And now that I've failed with the clip, let's see whether we can fail with the nib as well. I'm going to polish this up first. Might as well polish it before I destroy it. So it'll be nice and shiny at its death. Put it on my jeweler's cloth and give it a good buff. I warned you that there would be a bris happening on this nib, and I'm going to try to make it like my favorite nibectomy on this blue pearl. You can see that I clipped that off and then polished it into a stub. I'm going to see whether I can do the same thing with this nib and get them about the same. So I got this nib to where it's about 1.0 or so, 0.9 millimeters in distance between the tines there. So let's see whether I can do the same thing with this. I'm going to try to do it absolutely straight, and again doing this over the camera. In fact, I think I'm not going to do it over the camera. I'm going to get my magnifying lenses on and do this very carefully, because once it's done, it's done. But I'm going to try to clip it off just like that, so it's as straight as possible. I don't want it to go oblique one side or another. If it's going to go oblique, it should go left for me, because that's the way I write. But I'm going to turn the camera off and see if I can do this carefully. So there we are, clipped it off. Doesn't look too bad. It'll be very ragged, as you can see, especially on that point. So I'm going to use some 400 grit to knock those edges off. So I'll have sharp edges on all four corners of that rectangle, especially on the very point. And I'm going to try to ease off those edges first. Gold is very soft, so it will knock those edges off very quickly. And then I'm going to go with more micromesh from 1500 grit through to 12,000. And then, before I go any further with trying to get that into a nice smooth stub, I'm going to put the nib and feed back together again in the section so that I can put it back in the barrel and actually write with it as I'm polishing it, so I can test it to make sure it's working okay. So that's what I would say is a rough stub. I've just scored it across the 400 grit a couple of strokes on all corners, on all sides, and at an angle to the sandpaper. That gave it an angle for me to work with, like that, when I start polishing it. So I think that is going to work well to start. Now I'll put it back in the section with the feed. There, now the feed's nice and shiny. Feed and the nib back together again, so that they're lined up, which they weren't to begin with. Should have done this first. So I'm going to put the section back in the pen. Now I got that whole section and body blind cap back together again, so I've got some purchase on it with which to push the nib all the way in. We knew that the issue with it from the beginning was that the nib was too long in there. So I'm going to hold on to this with one piece of rubber mat and grab onto the barrel with another piece of mat, and we're going to rotate it around just to find the path of least resistance, There. And I'm going to give it a good shove. And that's as far as it wants to go. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't want to go any farther than that. So that's where that bevel is. So I think that's as far as it goes. That's very long. So I'm starting to suspect that this section is not Parker, that this is a replacement section. But now that we have the nib back in the pen, and I have clipped off the nib, so the bris is done. Now we have to polish out that nib so that it will write smoothly. We'll see whether it actually writes to begin with, roughly. But first things first, I'm going to dip test this nib. Remember, I've just cut this straight off with my nail clippers and only dragged it a little bit on 400 grit to knock the edges off. So this is going to be very rough if it writes at all. It's not really writing at all horizontally. Very rough. The tines are aligned and they're fairly tight together. So I think that's good to start. So now I can start going at my micro mesh a bit by bit. Put a bead of water on there, and I'm going to stroke it at the angle at which I hold my pen to the page, up and down and side to side, and give it some figure eights, and then I'm going to start knocking some more of those corners off on the top and side edges. At 1500 grit, this is very abrasive, and gold is very soft, so I'm going to go very easily with this and test it as I go. And I'm just feeling for any rough edges I may have missed. That's feeling better. That's writing now that I've knocked those edges off. But you can see that it's starting to get smoother all the way around, and there's that beveled edge right there. It's like a chisel point, and I'm trying to keep the corners from being sharp. Just going to dip test again here. Oh, I'm already loving this nib. Oh my God. You never know whether it's going to work or not. It's just, there's lots of feedback, of course, but it's just writing beautifully now. And I'm only at 3200 grit right now. So I'm going to go back up through all the rest of these and polish this up until it is silky smooth. Of course, you don't have to watch through all this. I'll just fast forward. I'm going to dip test. I've just done 8,000 grit. Still, with my writing, got a bit of an edge right there, so I'm going to go back to my 8,000. Yeah, and that edge is gone now. Now we can move up to 12,000 grit. So here we go. I think I've taken all the edges out of it. 1952 Parker Vacumatic Emerald Pearl. So that horizontal line has now thickened up. So that's probably a 0.4 to 0.5. And that vertical line has remained about the same, I'm guessing, at 0.9 to 1.0 millimeters. Of course, I'll measure these lines out with my Richard Binder line width chart and see what it is. But this is a very smooth, beautiful stub, 14 karat gold, 1.0 millimeter stub. Line variation, yep, it has some real bounce to it. Reverse, yeah, I could polish that up a bit more for reverse. Still quite scratchy. And let's check the wetness, which is very wet, still very wet. Look at that. And before I polish this up, I want to do two things. I want to put the breather tube in, which I hadn't done before. There we go. And in there deeply. And then we're going to measure it empty. 10.06 press. Tear. And then we're going to fill this pen and see how much ink it holds. Dip that in. Listen for bubbles. And when there are no more bubbles, we know we're reasonably full. Put the blind cap back on. And then measure. Now it says 10.0. You all saw that it said 10.06 when I first did that. So I'm going to turn this off and on again. And we're just going to do some math. 11.3. And 11.3 minus 10.06 is 1.24 milliliters of ink. So I've had the pen apart and cleaned it out again. I started writing with it last night thinking that everything was fine. And it was getting starved of ink, and it was skipping, and all kinds of things. And I've determined two things. One thing, that point right there ended up having a little bit of a divot on it, right at the very top. And I determined that was because the tines were not aligned when I was doing some of that scraping and grinding. It was like it had a chip in its tooth. And I went at it again, starting with about 3600 grit. Made sure that I had the tines together, adjusted them. Then I put my fingernail right on that edge and dragged it across until I had a very even, together, sharp line. And I'm going to go back through all the micro mesh and polish that up again. But I also noticed that these tines were very, very tight together. Now I've separated them some, but they're still touching right at the very top. I want to have a little bit of a gap. So I let it sit overnight with a spark plug gapping tool of 0.05 in it. And when I woke up this morning, it was still a little bit tighter than I want it to. So I'm going to let it sit for a while with a number 006 in it while I do some other things, because there's another thing I've noticed, and that is that this feed is a Parker feed, and this is a Parker nib, but this feed does not belong with this section. This section has this bevel at the back. Now, this might be a Parker section from Parker, Canada. I've never seen anything like this. Maybe some of you in the audience will tell me whether they've seen any section like this. But this bevel in the back, when you put the feed in that section, that's as far as it goes, right there. That keeps that feed and nib further out of that section than I would like. I would like that feed to go into about there, that feed and nib, so that the nib would go in to about there, like that, and maybe just to the bottom of the 5/7. I don't think having that feed and nib out that far is allowing ink to flow all the way to the tip properly. I've taken the feed and I've run my X-Acto knife down those two channels to open them up some, but I've decided that what I'm going to do is I'm going to grind this ebonite feed down. I'm going to grind it down about a couple of millimeters. I would like that feed to sit down to about where that bevel starts, right there, so that it more closely matches that kind of depth. You see where that nib is sitting. Now I'm going to grind that down with my Dremel tool, and I'm going to give it another bevel. As Rosanna Dana once said, it's always something. There, now I've ground off about a little more than 1/16 of an inch, and I beveled the edge again, and I got it so that when I put it fully up against that bevel right there, I'm down to the first fin of that feed. So when I put the nib back together again, it should be fully further seated in that section. Now I've got this sitting on a 0.006 spark plug gapping tool, trying to get those nib tines separated a little bit more. You might be able to see if I put a white card behind there and we get the magnifier back on again, that it's still fairly tight in there. I should be able to see daylight through that nib. So I'm going to let that sit a little bit more. So now I think I've got that separated a little bit more. I'm going to put it back together with the feed so that they sit together. And remember not to forget get some rubber mat gripping material and give it a shove. There we go. There. Now that's deeper in that section where it belongs. Now I'm going to go through my micro mesh again where I left off, which was at 3600 grit. Do my figure eights and circles and so forth to get that polished out. Okay, so I've gone back through it a few times, and I think I've got that nib aligned properly and polished up nicely It's looking pretty shiny all the way around. It's looking nicely aligned. And the important thing is, it's writing. Just like that. It runs out of ink. Just going to push a little bit more ink through it. Writing beautifully and smoothly. And it's not again. I don't know. I turn the camera on and it doesn't work, and I turn the camera off and it works. I think I figured out what happened here is that I ran out of ink. I was doing so much testing. So I filled it up again, and it seems to be writing okay now. I'm just getting a few tiny scratches here and then depending on how I turn the nib on the edges. So whenever I find a little bit of scratch like that, I'll just give it a little bit of a polish to get that edge out. It always helps when you have ink in the pen. So now that has taken twice as long as I expected it to. I can go ahead and try to polish this pen up and get that signature out of there. I could not get that jewel out of the top to remove the clip, but I'm going to polish the hardware, the cap band, and mask them off, and then go at the barrel and the cap and the blind cap. So I have to put my eyes on for this bit so I can see what the hell I'm doing. Let's start with that engraved signature there. 400 grit flexible sandpaper. It always comes right up as soon as you start sanding it. I'm going to start sanding it on either side as well because I don't want this to be a dent. And there we go. I've left the imprint, but got most of that name out of there, wherever it was. It was back here. And that little blemish that looked like a cigarette burn or some kind of a melting burn on the side is gone as well. So I've gone through the entire cap and barrel with 400 grit and then my micro mesh from 1500 through 12,000 grit. I masked off the gold band and I got that engraving out of the barrel. The imprint is still there, and now all I have to do is put the section back in the pen. I've had it on and off so many times I should add more grease. You can get this silicone oil wherever they sell treadmills because it is silicone oil for oiling treadmills. Who knew? Not that I'd ever know how to use a treadmill. I'd never want to exert myself and not get anywhere. Anyway, but you know what they say, no matter where you go, there you are. And there you are. But that pen is looking fine now. Actually, it's abroad. But it's all ready to go. So what are my thoughts about this resurrection? Well, this pen threw me a number of unexpected curves. I knew when I purchased this pen that the main challenges would be the removal of the personalized engraving and the broken tine on the nib. But I didn't expect the unusual section and misfitting nib and feed issue. I was able to solve the misfitting feed by grinding it a little shorter, and I was able to perform the nib bris fairly easily, and the nib polished up nicely and wrote beautifully, or so I thought. I wrote with the polished nib for a while, and that's when I discovered the nib tines were too tight and the feed was not supplying enough ink. I also discovered that I'd done some of the polishing with the tines somehow misaligned. It sort of teaches me that I have got to check with my loupe after every level of micromesh I go through. So I went back to square one, shortened the feed, spread the tines, and repolished from scratch. And the third time was the charm, except it wasn't. I was disappointed that the pen would write when I was recording, but stopped the moment I hit record. Camera shy, I guess. But luckily that was just the pen running out of ink. You had to check these things. Now it's writing beautifully and it looks almost brand new. I couldn't get the clip off, but I was able to polish up the cap and barrel to a lovely glossy shine without taking it off. And I polished up the gold as well, and it is just gleaming. The pen is now fully restored and an unusual example of a third-generation Parker Vacumatic. The pen was made in 1952, 4 years after Parker USA had discontinued the model, and the nib was manufactured in 1957. So I suspect it's a replacement nib. I have the feeling that someone tried to restore this pen. There was a relatively new diaphragm installed in the pen. It was torn and leaking, but it was relatively new. And I have no idea where this weird section came from. Perhaps one of you recognize this. Is it a part from Parker Canada, who are known for putting weird parts together? Whatever the mystery of this Canadian Parker Vacumatic Emerald Pearl is, it is now a gorgeous, smooth writing 14 karat gold stub nib fountain pen now. I already have my favorite Parker Vacumatic in this blue pearl with its own customized stub nib. So I'm going to offer this emerald pearl for sale. If you're interested in purchasing this pen, email me at inkquiringminds@gmail.com with your name and address, and I'll let you know how to pay my PayPal account. I'm selling it for $140 US plus $20 shipping. And there you have it. Thanks for watching. And that's all she wrote.
I made this.